Hi, Dave here with Ally Emergency Management, and welcome to the next video in our series on the operational planning process. In this video, we will be discussing stage 2 of the OPP, orientation. The purpose of the orientation stage is to answer the question, do I understand the problem and the requirements for a solution? So this is the first time in the OPP up to this point where we're actually going to spend some energy and thought looking at the nature of the problem and how we need to get to the end state. This will allow us to develop a shared understanding of the environment, the nature of the problem to be solved, our boss's intent, and that figures into mission analysis, the conditions for success, what the end state looks like. We'll develop an understanding of the tasks that must be completed and a clear statement of the mission. Now, I'm sure some of you by this point are saying, Dave, when are we going to get to the problem solving? Why are we spending all this time looking at analysis and background and this sort of thing? This is an important stage in the planning process because it allows us to understand the nature of the problem and get everybody pulling in the same direction. And it might be a little less obvious when you're talking about a relatively simple problem, but if you're talking about one that's complicated or in a complicated environment, there's many moving parts to the situation, or one that has a lot of internal and external players, having a process to get everybody looking at the problem in the same way is really, really important. And if you don't spend the time to analyze and think it through before, some of the factors that you're faced with later on might not become clear to you until it's too late. So we're going to take a look at the components of the orientation stage. First major component is the review of the situation. Now you're going to take the assessment of the environment that you did from one of our previous videos. That is going to be the keystone of review of the situation. It will allow you to take some time to understand things like time and space. And we talked about that earlier on in the big timeline between where we are now and where we're going to be when we accomplish our mission, what needs to be done and when, and the sequencing and that sort of thing comes out of this. Some of the cultural or social or economic structures or patterns. You'll have a chance to take a look at other organizations that are willing and capable to exist. And I've mentioned this before, and it will always be important, the logistical situation and the supply chain, as well as your own command and control infrastructure. So how you pass information, give direction, receive feedback. That's all important. That's all part of the review of the situation. You're going to end up making some assumptions. And the reason that we make assumptions is we don't necessarily have all of the facts we need to move forward with our planning. So if you're missing a piece of information, you don't just stop. You're going to make an assumption that allows you to carry on with your planning, and you're going to carry on. A couple of things about assumptions. First of all, they need to be valid. That means they need to be likely to be true. And that means they need to be necessary, which means it is filling a gap in your information that has actually stopped the planning process from proceeding. One of the pitfalls that my students used to fall into all the time was they would create an assumption that made it easier to get to the solution. The idea is not to assume away your problem. The idea is simply to be able to carry on with the planning process. And I hope people understand the distinction, because once you've identified an assumption, you need to take steps to fill that information gap. You need to confirm whether or not that assumption is real or not, that information is real or not. The last component of the orientation stage is mission analysis. Now, on the military side, mission analysis gets a lot of attention, and I think that's mostly because we've got this large organization, very hierarchical, with a lot of tiers in it, working in a very complicated, dynamic, ever-changing situation where, quite frankly, people get killed. So the people that own the plan at the beginning may not even be around at the end of the execution. So the military spends a lot of time in the mission analysis phase and be able to articulate not only what's going on, but why, so that if the situation changes or if somebody is no longer with the team, whoever's left understands things enough to carry on. So it's a pretty robust process for a reason. And I think the steps of that process are still applicable to a situation that's not quite as austere and not quite as full of risk. And the general steps are, what does my boss intend? And how can I support that intent? Where is the organization going? What is my part in that? And how can I help the organization move forward? I need to understand what tasks I've been assigned. And also, I need to spend some time in thinking about my implied tasks. So an implied task is basically a task that you derive through examination. For example, let's say my boss says, I want you to drive out to Chilliwack and get a cake. Great, that's my assigned task. My implied tasks are, well, I need to get a hold of a vehicle. I need to make sure that it's full of gas. I need to find the keys. I need to know where the cake place is. I need to have a map or a GPS. So those are all legitimate tasks that I wasn't told to do specifically, but they're implied in the main task. I need to understand what limitations I have on my freedom of action. And limitations basically fall into constraints, or things that I must do, and restraints, or things that I can't do. Doesn't matter if you get those two mixed up. The important thing is those limitations will define a box that I can move within to achieve my objective. And I got to make sure that I don't do something I'm not supposed to, or that I don't fail to do something that I have to do. And also coming out of this is my essential task. And once I've taken a look at my assigned task and my implied task and my limitations, through that analysis, something should jump out that is my essential task. It's the critical activity that I'm required to do to ensure that the mission is successful. And that will actually form a large part of the mission statement. And we'll talk about that soon. In the military context, I used to put a lot of conditions on my students as to how they crafted a mission statement for an operation order. I'm not going to get into a lot of those details here. Just suffice it to say that a good mission statement should be simple, it should be relatively short, and it really should have two main purposes. It should be able to articulate what it is that your team needs to do, and there should be some words around why you're doing it, the unifying purpose. The reason behind that is, and we've alluded to this before, if your team is out there executing the mission, doing their thing, and the situation changes, it's helpful that they should know enough about why they're doing what they're doing so they don't stop dead in their tracks. They can adjust, they can carry on, they can still achieve the mission. It's just that they may have to change a bit around the tasks and what they're doing. I wanted to share this story because I thought it was, for me anyways, a neat example of how a company sort of failed to keep in touch with their mission statement. And it's a story that I found in Forbes magazine about the Kodak company. Now, Kodak made film, and at its peak, they probably had like 90% of the US film market. And they failed to enter the digital age. And the interesting part was, it's not that it failed because it missed the digital age. Kodak actually invented the first digital camera back in '75, but they suppressed that and they didn't move forward with the electronic version. They focused on film because they didn't want their electronic photography section to basically cannibalize their film photography section. And Forbes really summed it up well, and this sort of resonated with me when we talk about mission analysis. Is the company thought they were in the business of making film, when in fact they were in the business of telling stories. And if they had had that distinction in mind, they probably would have made a more successful transition to the digital camera age at the expense of the physical film part. They didn't do that, and I think they filed for bankruptcy like in 2012. So not having the proper mission statement can really be detrimental to your business. And here we just take a look at the two components of a good mission statement. You want to articulate what's to be done, and you want to articulate why you're doing it. And that's all to build context for people who are going to be reviewing that mission statement later. At the end of the orientation stage, you should have most of the following: your mission statement, your critical task of the mission, information requirements, the information that we need to fill those gaps that we had to make assumptions about, analysis on any rivals or competitors and their possible courses of action, which we would have gotten through assessment of the environment. Something we didn't talk about, but it is important, an understanding of where you might be willing to accept risk and how to mitigate it. We'll talk a little bit more about risk in one of the future slides. But at some point, you need to start thinking about threats and hazards and what they are and how likely they might be and how severe they could be. And then you have to start thinking about decisions as to what level of risk is acceptable and how you can mitigate it when it gets past a certain point. After the orientation stage, you should be well into working on your relationships with other organizations and agencies that are going to be involved in the planning and understand who has the lead. And then again, and I can't drive this home enough, logistical preparations and which ones need to commence now, and your logistical team needs to get on that as soon as possible. That, in a nutshell, is stage 2, the orientation stage. In the next video, we will be talking about stage 3, course of action development. As always, if you've got any feedback or any questions, feel free to contact me at the email below, or take a look at our website, www.yourally.ca, for some good information on protecting your people and protecting your company in the COVID age. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.